Dan, the lover of women. Dan, a woman-loving man, lived in a small village. He was rich, very rich, and his fortune was known far and wide. But more than his riches, what Dan loved most were women. He had a special affection for them, and they all knew it. Whenever Dan saw a woman he liked, he presented her with money, gifts, or anything she wanted. Because he was so wealthy, women came to him easily, smiling and following him, and Dan welcomed them with open arms. Dan married a beautiful woman named Atiku. Atiku loved Dan, but she wasn't like other women. She was strong and stubborn, and in the village no one dared to challenge her. Her eyes glowed like fire when she was angry, and her words were sharp like blades. However, Dan didn't care. He loved his beautiful wife. Together they had children, and Atiku took care of the home. Even though Dan liked other women, Atiku remained by his side, watching and waiting. Everyone in the village knew Dan's love came with intensity. Atiku was not a woman to be trifled with, and so Dan's life was filled with wealth and women. But he didn't know what trouble was coming. Atiku loved Dan deeply, but his love was accompanied by fire. She didn't like seeing Dan's eyes wander to other women, which made her fill with rage. Whenever Atiku saw Dan talking to another woman, his face contorted with fury. No matter who it was, she fought, screamed and sent them away. Even though he had children with Dan, Atiku's heart remained restless. She loved him, but his love for other women made the ground shake beneath her feet. Dan's eyes were always looking for the next woman, and it infuriated Atiku. A new marriage and the beginning of problems. One day, Dan came home with news that shook Atiku's world. He had married another woman, named Ae. She was so beautiful that Dan couldn't resist. Ae had soft skin, a calm smile, and eyes that seemed to shine like the moon. From that moment on, problems began in Dan's house. Atiku's heart was filled with jealousy, and Ae became the target of his wrath. The house, once full of peace, began to shake with fighting and anger, and the storm that would lead to Dan losing his manhood was just beginning. Ae was gentle, with a soft voice and discreet movements. She never wanted trouble, but Atiku didn't care. From the day Ae entered the house, Atiku's anger grew like wildfire. She couldn't stand watching Ae and made a point of showing her fury every day. When Atiku ordered Ae to sweep the house, pointing with sharp eyes, Ae obeyed silently, cleaning every corner while Atiku's children laughed at her. When Atiku ordered her to fetch water, Ae would take the pot and walk to the stream, her feet dragging from exhaustion as she worked, while the children enjoyed watching how much their stepmother had to do. Unable to bear it any longer, Ae sought out Dan in hopes that he would help her, but Dan was always thinking about the next woman he could marry. He barely listened to Ae's complaints, saying, "I'll talk to her," but his words were empty and never came to fruition. Thus, Ae had to endure every day, while Atiku made his life more and more difficult, without any escape. Dan never rested his eyes, even with Atiku and Ae in his house. His love for women only grew. The arrival of Neka and the destruction of harmony. One day, while visiting the city, Dan met another woman, Neka. She was different from the women in the village, young with smooth skin, bright eyes and a smile that stopped anyone in their tracks. Dan couldn't resist and married her without thinking twice. But Neka was not like other wives. She didn't marry Dan for love, she just saw his riches. Deep down, she thought that this old man wouldn't last long, and when he died, she would take everything and leave the village forever. When Neka entered the house, the already broken peace fragmented even further. Atiku, who previously ruled the house with her stubbornness, felt threatened. Ae, who was already suffering in silence, now had to deal with Neka's boldness. Unlike Ae, who obeyed silently, Neka was bold and refused to be pushed. She didn't care about Atiku or Ae, nor was she afraid of Atiku's fiery temper or his intimidating behavior. Neka refused to do any household chores and made sure everyone knew she was in charge. Even Atiku's children had to obey, fetching water when Neka asked. Even Atiku's sharp words couldn't stop Neka, who did whatever she wanted. Dan, as usual, didn't care. He was blinded by Neka's beauty, giving her everything she wanted. Atiku and Ae's complaints fell on deaf ears, and with Neka's arrival, the house became a cauldron of anger, jealousy, and problems. The storm that had started with Ae was now a blazing fire, beyond control. When Atiku or Ae tried to complain, Dan ignored them, too busy enjoying Neka's company to care what anyone else said. Atiku and Ae's alliance. Atiku and Ae, don't you see how she treats us? Atiku shouted, but Dan didn't even look up. Ae, who had endured Ataku's cruelty for a long time, realized something important. The only way to deal with Neko was to team up with Ataku. Although Ataku had always been her rival, they shared the same goal now, to get rid of Neko. Ataku and Ae, once enemies, became allies, whispering and planning that if they didn't act soon, Neko would continue to control the house. Ataku and Ae's plan. The plan was simple: if they couldn't defeat Neko alone, they would do it together. The two women joined forces against the one woman who had destabilized their world. They knew Dan well. His eyes always wandered in search of the young and beautiful one, and that gave them an idea. If they could find a woman prettier than Neko, Dan's attention would be diverted, and Neko would lose her place as favorite wife. Tashi's introduction. "We need someone he can't resist," Ataku whispered to Ae one night. Ae nodded, acknowledging that this was the only way. After days of reflection, Ae remembered a woman he had seen in the village, Tashi. She was exactly the type Dan liked: tall, with skin as smooth and shiny as polished clay, and legs that seemed to go on forever. Her sweet smile and kind eyes made everyone look at her wherever she went. "She's perfect," said Ae with a mischievous smile. Ataka's eyes sparkled. They knew that if Dan saw Tashi, his heart would leap, and he would quickly make her his wife. The plan was drawn up. They would introduce Tashi to Dan, and thus Neko would be removed, with power shifting once again. Together they approached Tashi with their plan, offering her gifts and promises, saying that Dan would spoil her with riches if she became his wife. Tashi, eager for prosperity, agreed without hesitation. The trap was set. The trap completes. Tashi began spending time near the popular Pinga stand, knowing that Dan would soon notice her. Ataku and Ae waited, watching closely, certain that their plan would work and that Neko's reign in the house would come to an end. As Ataku and Ae had planned, Dan's eyes fell on Tashi one night while she was sitting at the dripping stall. Her tall figure, glowing skin, and sweet smile immediately caught his attention. Dan felt his heart speed up, and without wasting any time, he approached her. Within a few days, he decided that Tashi would be his next wife. Dan married Tashi, who was soon brought into the house as the fourth wife. Ataku and Ae watched in satisfaction as the plan unfolded, knowing that Dan's heart would now be distracted from Neko and that her once dominant power would begin to wane. Neko's fury. But Neko, upon hearing the news, was furious. Her face burned with anger, and she couldn't believe Dan had married yet another woman. She ran to him, her voice trembling, begging, "Dan, please, you don't need another wife. I am enough for you." Dan looked at her calmly and replied, "Neko, that's how I married you too. Ataku and Ae were already here before you arrived. You'll get used to it, just like they do." Neko felt as if a stone had been thrown into her chest. He couldn't believe how easily Dan dismissed his feelings. He didn't care the same way he had married her. While Ataku and Ae were already in the house, Tashi had also joined them. Neko had no other option but to accept, but her anger was boiling inside. The power imbalance. While Ataku and Ae celebrated silently, knowing that the balance of power had shifted once again, Tashi was in the house, and now it was Neko's turn to feel the impact of being left aside. Neko's heart filled with frustration with each passing day. She watched as Ataku and Tashi approached, whispering and laughing together, leaving her out of the loop. She felt like a foreigner in her own home. Whenever they gathered at night to share stories and jokes, Neko remained alone, anger building inside her. He couldn't take it anymore and decided to visit his mother for comfort or advice. Tashi's confession. Neko's mother listened calmly as she vented her frustration. "Mom, I can't take it anymore. He barely looks at me, and now he's married another woman, Tashi." Neko's mother was calm. She caressed Neko's hand and said, "Patience, my daughter. Remember why you married Dan. He is old, he will soon be gone, and all his wealth will be yours." Neko nodded, trying to calm down. His mother's words made sense. She had married Dan for his wealth, not for love. All he had to do was wait, but waiting wasn't easy. Every day, Dan paid more attention to Tashi, presenting her with gold jewelry, necklaces, new clothes. Neko's frustration only increased. Tashi's gaze lighting up Dan's heart made Neko's blood boil. She had been patient for a long time, but she knew deep down that her turn would come. For now he would wait, but his anger was bubbling beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. The horrible discovery. One sunny morning, it was Tashi's turn to cook for the whole house. The sun had barely risen when Tashi began preparing the meal. As the hours passed, the aroma of spices and herbs filled the air, reaching the neighbors. People passing through the village would smell it and wonder if there was a celebration going on. The aroma was so rich and delicious that even the birds seemed to stop to enjoy it. Tashi had outdone himself, preparing a soup so delicious that when it was finished, the entire house was filled with anticipation. The wives, children, and even the servants waited eagerly to taste the meal. When it was time to serve, Tashi brought out bowls of steaming soup with a mild side of noodles. Everyone gathered to eat, and as they enjoyed themselves, praise filled the air. "Tashi, this is the best soup I've ever tasted," exclaimed Adaku, licking his fingers. "Yes, what's your secret?" added Ae, eyes wide with surprise. Even children, who were usually picky eaters, ate until they were full. Everyone was happy, talking and laughing while eating. The joy of the meal filled the yard like a festival. But while everyone was enjoying the food, Nneka felt restless. She had noticed something strange. Dan, who was usually out fetching women or sitting around, hadn't been seen all day. It was unusual for him to be so quiet, especially on a day when the house was filled with delicious food. While the others continued eating and praising Tashi's cooking, Nneka's mind was spinning. Where was Dan? Normally, he would be the first to eat, but he hadn't touched the food, and no one seemed to notice. His eyes scanned the room, and the uneasy feeling in his stomach grew. Something wasn't right. Nneka set her bowl aside and stood up silently, her heart pounding with worry. He needed to find out where Dan was, but a strange fear made his steps slow. Why hadn't anyone else noticed? And why did everyone seem so calm? With a lump in her throat, Nneka decided it was time to investigate. Something about this banquet was very, very wrong. The search and the shocking discovery. As the day progressed, Dan's friends arrived at the house, concerned about his whereabouts. They had planned to meet him for a big party, and Dan, who never missed a date, was unusually late. His friends called out to him at the gate, but there was no sign of him. "Where is Dan?" asked one of them. When the wives came out to greet them, Tashi, calm as always, smiled and said, "He left early this morning. Won't be back for a while." Dan's friends were perplexed. Dan never left unannounced, especially on the day of a party. Even so, they trusted Tashi's words and were about to leave when Nneka, who had been observing everything silently, stepped forward. "No, something isn't right," said Nneka, her voice tense. "He hasn't been seen all morning. We need to check Tashi's room." The other wives and Dan's friends exchanged confused looks. Tashi looked indignant, her face still calm. "What? Why would Dan be in my room?" she asked sweetly. But Nneka didn't give in. His heart was pounding, and the strange feeling he had had all morning was now too strong to ignore. "I don't know," she replied. "But we need to check." Reluctantly, everyone followed Nneka to Tashi's room. The air was thick with tension as they opened the door. Inside, the room was silent. Nneka's stomach turned as she looked around, until suddenly she let out a scream. There on the ground was Dan, his hands and legs bound tightly with ropes, and his mouth muffled with a cloth. Their clothes were stained with blood, and the sight made everyone freeze in horror. But the most shocking part was what was missing. Dan's manhood had been cut off. A scream ripped through the room as everyone backed away, covering their mouths in shock. Adaku and Ae remained motionless, their faces pale. Dan's friends rushed to untie the knots quickly, but it was too late. Dan's body was lifeless, his eyes barely open. The man who was once proud and powerful was now broken and bleeding. Tashi remained in the doorway, her calm smile gone. She didn't say a word as the horrific scene unfolded before her. The terrifying discovery shook the house to its core. The man who once dominated his wives, pursued women, and lived in luxury was now powerless, with his life hanging by a thread. The house, once full of laughter and joy from the feast, had transformed into a place of fear and shock. Now, all eyes turned to Tashi, knowing that she held the key to this nightmare. Tashi's confession and the truth revealed. The news of what had happened spread quickly through the village. It didn't take long for a crowd to gather in front of Dan's house. Tashi was detained, with her arms tied and her face no longer calm. The air was filled with whispers, and everyone waited for her to speak, wanting to know why she had done something so terrible, cutting off Dan's manhood. Silence hung in the air until Tashi finally raised his head. His voice was cold but firm. "Yes, I did that. I cut off Dan's manhood. The crowd was shocked, but she continued without hesitation. I couldn't take it anymore. Dan couldn't stop marrying one woman after another. Even after marrying me, he didn't rest. Just yesterday, I saw him with another woman, holding her closely. She was young and beautiful, and I thought, here we go again. Yet another woman he planned to bring into this house. The crowd listened in shock, hanging on Tashi's every word. Her voice grew more intense as she continued. He laughed with her, touched her face, and I knew he would make her his wife. I wouldn't let that happen again. I wanted everything to end once and for all. If I cut off his virility, he would no longer be able to marry any woman or pursue anyone. Then, Tashi paused, her voice shaking slightly. I didn't know. The woman he was with was his sister. A murmur spread through the crowd. Dan's sister? No, another woman? Tashi's eyes darkened as he continued his confession. I thought she was just another woman he wanted to marry. I explained my regret, that I didn't know the woman he was with was his sister. I was led to believe he was saving me from being cast aside again, like his other wives before me. So I planned to stop him once and for all. Tashi turned her cold gaze towards Ataku and Ae. But I wasn't the only one. Ataku and Ae were also involved. They had their own plan, cut off Dan's virility so he would stop getting married and stay at home. But they didn't have the courage to do it alone. So I did. The crowd's eyes turned to Ataku and Ae, who remained frozen. Ataku, always proud and strong, now looked small and scared. Ae's hands shook as he tried to speak, but guilt was written all over his face. Ataku stammered. It was just talk, we never thought she would actually do it. But the truth was already exposed. Tashi's envy and misunderstanding drove her to commit the terrible act, and Ataku and Ae's schemes only made the situation worse. The crowd could hardly believe what they were hearing. A mixture of jealousy, misunderstanding, and betrayal had led to the destruction of Dan's home. As Tashi's confession hung in the air, the entire village remained frozen in disbelief. The final revelation and consequences. And the soup you all ate this morning, Tashi added in a cold, chilling voice. The meat of that soup was Dan's manhood. A wave of horror swept through the crowd. The women gasped and the men recoiled in disgust, their stomachs churning as they realized what they had consumed. The joyful banquet had turned into an unimaginable nightmare. Ataku, who had been silent until then, saw his chance and tried to slip away discreetly, hoping to escape the villagers' wrath. But before he could disappear, someone grabbed his arm. Where do you think you're going, Ataku? Called a voice. The crowd quickly surrounded her, forcing her to face their enraged voices. Ataku's face turned pale as he realized there was no escape. Trembling, she stammered. I didn't want that to happen. It was just a moment of anger. I was so frustrated with Dan's incessant marriages. I just suggested cutting off his manhood out of desperation. I never thought Tashi would actually do this. The crowd began to murmur in disbelief. Then someone shouted. You planned this, Ataku. Ataku's eyes turned to Ae, who was also standing there, embarrassed and scared. It was just talk, Ataku tried to explain. We were all mad, but I never wanted it to come to that. I just wish he would stop chasing women. Residents were not convinced. The damage was already done, and Dan's life was lost because of Ataku's careless words and Tashi's cold actions. Ae remained silent at the side, her face full of regret, but Ataku was at the center of it all. The entire village was shocked by the evil that had occurred in Dan's house. What started as a plan to get rid of a wife had turned into something dark and twisted. The once proud and stubborn Ataku was now trapped in the web she herself had helped weave, and the villagers could hardly believe what they had witnessed. The story of betrayal, envy, and anger had reached its darkest point, and the weight of their actions weighed heavily on Ataku, Tashi, and the entire village. Despite the residents' efforts to save Dan, his injuries were too severe and he died a short time later. His powerful presence in the village has disappeared, leaving behind a house destroyed by betrayal. The village elders decided what to do with the women involved. Tashi, the one responsible for the unthinkable act, and Ataku, whose jealous plots led to the tragedy, were at the center of the storm. Ae, although less involved, was also exiled, as her silence and participation contributed to Dan's downfall. The women were forced to leave the village, their heads bowed and once proud faces now full of shame and regret. Ataku, once feared and respected, was now just a shadow of herself. Tashi, who had entered Dan's house with plans for wealth, was left with nothing. The village, still shocked by the events, decided that Dan's children would inherit his estate. When they were older, they would be cared for by relatives until they could claim their rightful place. The house, once filled with laughter, envy, and turmoil, now stood quiet, its history forever marked by tragedy. As the years passed, the story of how Ataku and Tashi betrayed Dan spread beyond the village. People whispered about her around campfires, and the story became a warning to others about the dangers of envy, greed, and revenge. Although time has passed, the memory of that fateful day has remained in the hearts of the villagers, reminding them of the darkness that can arise from within. The once great Dan, brought down by the very women he trusted, became a ghost in the village's history, and the story of Ataku's betrayal would never be forgotten. The end and consequences. The village elders decided what to do with the women involved. Tashi, the one responsible for the unthinkable act, and Ataku, whose jealous plots led to the tragedy, were at the center of the storm. Ae, although less involved, was also exiled, as her silence and participation contributed to Dan's downfall. The women were forced to leave the village, their heads bowed and once proud faces now full of shame and regret. Ataku, once feared and respected, was now just a shadow of herself. Tashi, who had entered Dan's house with plans for wealth, was left with nothing. The village, still shocked by the events, decided that Dan's children would inherit his estate. When they were older, they would be cared for by relatives until they could claim their rightful place. The house, once filled with laughter, envy, and turmoil, now stood quiet, its history forever marked by tragedy. As the years passed, the story of how Ataku and Tashi betrayed Dan spread beyond the village. People whispered about her around campfires, and the story became a warning to others about the dangers of envy, greed, and revenge. Although time has passed, the memory of that fateful day has remained in the hearts of the villagers, reminding them of the darkness that can arise from within. The once great Dan, brought down by the very women he trusted, became a ghost in the village's history, and the story of Ataku's betrayal would never be forgotten. Closing. I hope you liked the story. If so, please enjoy the video, comment on what you learned from the story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting stories like this. Thanks.